He stepped into the elevator to eliminate the lawyer who was going to lock him away forever. But by the time the doors opened on the ground floor, he had decided to burn the entire city down to protect her. The municipal courthouse was a tomb at 11 o'clock at night, echoing with nothing but the sterile hum of the fluorescent lights and the mechanical whir of the descent. Inside the gold-paneled elevator, Nyla had her back pressed completely flat against the cold brass railing. Her professional Navy suit, the armor she wore to battle corrupt defense attorneys and cynical judges, offered absolutely zero protection against the man currently caging her in. She clutched a stack of heavy manila files tightly against her chest like a physical shield. These folders were her magnum opus. They held 2 years of sleepless nights, tracing offshore shell companies and connecting the bloody dots of the city's underbelly directly to the man standing inches from her face. She believed in the system with a rigid, almost naive idealism. She believed that if she followed the letter of the law, justice would be an absolute guarantee. She was about to learn how dangerous blind loyalty could be. Looming over her was Han Woo-Jin. He was tall, radiating an oppressive, controlled intimidation. Lethal ink crept up his neck and disappeared under his collar, a sharp, violent contrast to his perfectly tailored dark suit. The tight space smelled of expensive cologne, crisp ozone, and the faint, undeniable trace of gunpowder. He leaned in, his gaze intense and calculating, carrying the quiet confidence of a man who owned the very shadows she was trying to illuminate. He had cornered her here to tie up a loose end, to silence the brilliant, unyielding prosecutor, who was days away from securing his life sentence. But as he trapped her there, breathing in the sharp scent of her shock, he noticed something unexpected. Nyla's wide eyes held fear, yes, but behind it was a fierce, unyielding resilience. She wasn't begging. She wasn't breaking. Then, his gaze drifted from her defiant face down to the damning files crushed against her chest. Woo-Jin went completely still. The names printed on the top tabs of the evidence logs weren't his lieutenants. They were her own superiors. The district attorney. The chief of police. In a fraction of a second, the lethal calculus in his mind shifted. He wasn't looking at a prosecutor who had finally outsmarted him. He was looking at a lamb being led to the slaughter by the very shepherd she trusted. Her own bosses had fed her breadcrumbs, weaponized her brilliance, and positioned her as the perfect, disposable target for a rival syndicate's bullet, using him as the ultimate scapegoat. For a man who had spent his entire life bathed in violence and self-preservation, this was the moment the dark trajectory of his life fractured. He could let her die, let her corrupt mentors take the fall and walk away clean. It was the ruthless play. Instead, an unfamiliar urge gripped him. A violent need to pull this uncorrupted woman from the wreckage of her own broken system, even if it meant dismantling his own empire to do it. The elevator hit the ground floor with a heavy jolt. The doors slid open to the dark garage, but neither of them moved. The heavy iron gates of the Han estate closed with a heavy metallic thud that sounded entirely too much like a gavel striking a sound block. Nyla had been smoothly abducted from the courthouse garage, escorted into the back of a blacked-out SUV without a single word spoken. Now she stood in the center of a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline of a city that suddenly felt millions of miles away. It was a beautiful, terrifying gilded cage, lined with imported leather and silent, heavily armed guards stationed just beyond the mahogany doors. Woo-Jin stood by a minimalist marble bar, pouring a glass of amber liquid with a stillness that was deeply unnerving. He was waiting for the breakdown. He was waiting for the tears, the frantic bargaining, and the desperate pleas for survival that his ruthless world ran on. He took a slow sip, turned around and found Nyla sitting calmly at his massive dining table. She hadn't run for the locked elevator. She hadn't screamed. Instead, she had slipped her navy suit jacket off, draped it over the back of the expensive chair, and spread her manila files across the dark wood. She was methodically organizing her evidence. "You aren't going to kill me," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, though the slight, involuntary tremble in her hands betrayed the massive amount of adrenaline surging through her veins. Woo-Jin paused, the heavy crystal glass resting against his tattooed hand. "It is entirely too early in the evening for you to be making assumptions about your life expectancy." "It's not an assumption. It's a legal deduction." Nyla looked up, her wide, dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the air in the room suddenly feel too thin. "If you wanted me dead, I wouldn't have made it out of that courthouse. But you saw the authorization tabs on these files. You saw District Attorney Vance's signature on the secondary surveillance orders. You know I'm the bait. She watched his jaw tighten. She was playing a dangerous psychological game, pushing a lethal predator into a corner just to see how he would react. She needed leverage, and her sharp intellect was the only weapon she had left in a room where she was entirely outgunned. They set me up to be assassinated by your rivals, and they are going to use your existing criminal record to frame you for it. Nyla continued, tapping a finger against the paperwork. You didn't bring me here to be your prisoner. You brought me here because my brain is the only thing that can untangle the legal noose they just tied around your neck. Woo-Jin set his glass down. He moved slowly across the room, stopping only when he was leaning directly into her space, close enough for her to feel the dangerous heat radiating off him. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience and fear. But looking down at this brilliant, unyielding woman who refused to shatter under his shadow, something dark and dormant shifted in his chest. A dangerous, protective obsession began to take root, softening the brutal edges of a man who hadn't considered the possibility of his own redemption in over a decade. Check, Woo-Jin murmured, his voice a low, gravelly promise as he stared at her lips. Your move, counselor. Nyla didn't back away. The air between them was thick, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a violent, destructive storm. Woo-Jin was close enough that she could trace the precise, lethal ink of the tattoos winding up the side of his throat. Every biological instinct in her body screamed at her to step back, to yield territory to the apex predator in the room. She forced her feet to remain planted on the polished marble floor. My move. Nyla's voice was remarkably steady, betraying absolutely none of the chaotic adrenaline hammering against her ribs. She looked directly into his calculating dark eyes, refusing to drop her gaze. My move is telling you that intimidation is a luxury we can no longer afford. You run an empire on fear, Mr. Han. But fear won't draft a federal defense, and it certainly won't stop the bullet District Attorney Vance has designated for both of us. Woo-Jin's eyes darkened, the sharp lines of his face tightening. For over a decade, his mere physical presence had been enough to make hardened syndicate bosses shatter and corrupt politicians sweat. Grown men would have looked away by now, terrified of the violence humming beneath his tailored suit. Yet here was this unarmed, brilliant black woman, standing completely toe-to-toe with him in the heart of his own heavily guarded fortress. The power dynamic, which he had controlled with absolute, suffocating certainty since the elevator doors closed, was actively fracturing. He was used to victims who cowered and enemies who threatened. He had no protocol for a hostage who treated him like a hostile co-counsel, and the terrifying, unspoken truth settling in his chest was that he didn't hate it. In fact, it was intoxicating. He tilted his head, studying her with a dangerous new fascination. The protective instinct that had unexpectedly flared in the courthouse garage was now rapidly evolving into a searing, obsessive heat. She wasn't just a resilient survivor. She was a queen playing on a board she had only just discovered, and she was already commanding the room. You are demanding a partnership from a man who takes hostages, Nyla, Woo-Jin murmured. The low, gravelly sound of her name on his tongue felt dangerously right. He reached out slowly, his large tattooed hand brushing past her arm to tap the edge of the manila folder, though his intense gaze never left her face. In my world, this kind of defiance usually carries a very steep physical price. Then it is a good thing we aren't playing by the rules of your world tonight, she countered, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. We are in the crosshairs. If you want to burn their conspiracy to the ground, you need to stop treating me like a captive and start treating me like your only way out. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the heavy, shadowed silence of the penthouse. Woo-Jin slowly pulled back, a lethal, breathtaking smirk finally touching the corner of his mouth. The fear he relied on was entirely useless here, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. He was completely, irrevocably captivated. The sprawling dining table in the Han estate had become a war room. Midnight had bled into the early hours of the morning, the heavy silence of the penthouse broken only by the sharp rustle of manila paper and the clink of ice against crystal. Nyla stood over the scattered documents, a pen tightly gripped in her hand, tracing a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and redacted surveillance logs. She had spent her entire career worshipping the law. She believed in the sanctity of the courtroom, the absolute morality of a badge, and the undeniable truth of a judge's gavel. But as she cross-referenced the financial ledgers, Woo-Jin had quietly slid across the table to complete her puzzle. The pristine image of her world began to rot. She found it buried on page 42 of a seized asset report. A wire transfer from a rival syndicate, routed through a shell corporation, and deposited directly into a blind trust. The trust belonged to District Attorney Vance, her mentor, the man who had pinned on her first prosecutorial badge, and called her the uncorruptible future of the city. The date of the transfer perfectly aligned with the exact night Vance had ordered her to pull Woo-Jin's security detail for a routine audit. It wasn't a bureaucratic oversight. It was a purchased assassination, and she was the bait they had sold. The pen slipped from Nyla's fingers, hitting the dark wood with a hollow clatter. The air in the room suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The justice system she had sacrificed her sleep, her safety, and her life to uphold was nothing more than a rival cartel wearing expensive suits and federal badges. The betrayal hit her with the physical force of a blow to the chest, a cold, devastating realization that she had been fighting for an institution infinitely more treacherous than the criminal standing in the room with her. Woo-Jin watched the exact moment her idealism shattered. For a man who had built a ruthless empire by exploiting the broken pieces of his enemies, this was the moment he should have capitalized on her vulnerability. The old Woo-Jin, the untouchable boss who traded exclusively in fear, would have used her devastation to force her submission. Instead, a quiet, completely unfamiliar instinct overrode his conditioning. A need to protect, not just her life, but whatever fragments of her spirit were left intact. He stepped close, moving into her space not as a captor, but as an anchor. He didn't offer empty apologies or the kind of hollow comfort she was used to from politicians. He simply picked up the glass of amber liquid he had poured earlier and pressed it firmly into her trembling hand. His large, tattooed fingers briefly curled over hers, offering a silent, grounding warmth against the freezing reality of her betrayal. In a world completely corrupted by lies, the feared Mafia boss was the only honest man left standing, and Nyla finally understood that surviving meant stepping fully into his darkness. Nyla took the glass. The amber liquid burned down her throat, a sharp, necessary fire that chased away the freezing numbness of betrayal. She set the heavy crystal down on the scattered financial ledgers, right on top of District Attorney Vance's name, and finally looked up at the man she had spent 2 years trying to put in a federal penitentiary. Woo-Jin didn't step back. He remained entirely too close, his towering frame casting a long protective shadow over the damning documents. He watched her process the death of her idealism, his dark eyes intensely focused. "You spent your life believing that rules keep people safe," Woo-Jin said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the quiet expanse of the penthouse. "You believe that a badge, a gavel, or a piece of paper signed by a judge creates a shield. Tonight you learned what my world has always known. Rules are just polite suggestions for people who don't have the power to break them." Nyla crossed her arms, defensive but listening. Her pulse was still racing, but the fear had mutated into a sharp, dangerous clarity. "And your world is better? A world built on violence and extortion." "My world is honest," he countered smoothly. He leaned his hands flat against the edge of the mahogany table, caging her in once again. But this time the suffocating threat felt entirely external to them both. Inside his reach she was untouchable. "In your world a corrupt man hides behind a polished title and sends a brilliant prosecutor to die quietly in an alley. In my world, if a man wants you dead, he has to look me in the eye when he tries." He reached out, his tattooed fingers lightly brushing the edge of the manila folder before resting mere inches from her hand. True protection, Nyla, is never passive. It cannot be legislated or argued in a courtroom. It requires the absolute, terrifying certainty of disproportionate retaliation. His gaze lifted, locking onto hers with a possessive, consuming heat that made her breath catch. To keep something or someone truly safe, you must be willing to become the monster that the monsters fear. The raw, unfiltered truth of his words settled heavily over her. She wanted to argue, to pull out a legal statute or a moral high ground to throw back in his face. But the evidence of her broken system was literally scattered across his dining table. The law had offered her up as a blood sacrifice. The ruthless Mafia boss was the only one offering her a sword. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, the space between them shrinking to a dangerous fraction of an inch. "Now," Woo-Jin murmured, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw in a fleeting, breathtaking breach of their boundaries. "You stop trying to arrest the devil and you let him work for you." The amber liquid still burned pleasantly in Nyla's chest as the first faint, gray light of dawn began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. The transition from night to morning mirrored the irreversible shift inside her mind. She looked down at the scattered evidence of her ruined career, and then at the imposing, dangerous man standing mere inches away. If District Attorney Vance wanted to play a dirty game, he had drastically underestimated the player he put on the board. Nyla didn't step away from Woo-Jin. Instead, she reached right past his tailored arm, picking up a red marker she had pulled from her briefcase hours ago. She walked past the Mafia boss, her heels clicking with absolute authority against the marble, and stopped in front of the massive glass window overlooking the waking city. Without asking for permission, she began writing directly on the pristine glass. Names, dates, wire transfers, the entire anatomy of Vance's corrupt syndicate. Woo-Jin turned slowly, watching her. For the first time since she had been shoved into his blacked-out SUV, Nyla wasn't acting like a woman negotiating for her life. She was acting like a lethal prosecutor building a RICO case, and she had just conscripted the city's most feared criminal as her lead investigator. "Vance thinks he insulated himself with these shell companies," Nyla said, her voice sharp and devoid of its earlier tremor. She drew a hard, violent line connecting the DA's name to the rival cartel boss. "Legally, it takes months to subpoena these offshore accounts. But we don't have months, and we are no longer using subpoenas." She turned around, the marker held like a scalpel. Her dark, resilient eyes met Woo-Jin's, the fear entirely replaced by a cold, brilliant fire. "I need the ledger from the docks," she demanded, the instruction falling from her lips as naturally as if she were addressing a junior associate. "I need the port security footage from the night of the raid, and I need access to your phantom accounts to trace his money backward." The silence in the room stretched, heavy and electric. The armed guards positioned by the mahogany doors shifted uncomfortably, waiting for their boss to put this hostage back in her place. No one issued orders to Han Woo-Jin, but Woo-Jin just stared at her, a breathtaking, dangerous smirk slowly spreading across his face. The terrifying power imbalance that usually defined his world was actively shattering, replaced by an intoxicating, volatile partnership. She was challenging his control, seamlessly weaponizing his darkness to bring down her own corrupt house. In doing so, she was unknowingly offering his blood-stained legacy, a twisted, unexpected path to redemption. He didn't reprimand her. He didn't remind her who owned the cage she was standing in. Instead, Woo-Jin loosened his dark silk tie, rolled up his sleeves to reveal the full lethal extent of his ink, and walked to the glass beside her. "Give the counselor whatever she needs," he ordered his men, his eyes never leaving Nyla's. "We have a trial to prepare for." For 11 years, Han Woo-Jin had operated with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had absolutely nothing to lose. In his world, attachments were lethal liabilities. Affection was simply a ransom note waiting to be written. But as he stood in the shadows of his own penthouse, watching Nyla finally succumb to exhaustion over a stack of heavily redacted wiretap transcripts, he realized he was fundamentally, irrevocably compromised. She had been in his gilded cage for 4 days. In that time, she hadn't just dismantled District Attorney Vance's financial records, she had entirely dismantled his self-control. The sharp, intelligent way she cross-examined his hardened lieutenants, the defiant tilt of her chin when he tried to order her to rest, the way she absently tapped her pen against her lips. Every small detail had become a consuming, dangerous obsession. His secure phone vibrated, shattering the heavy quiet. His second-in-command stepped into the room, his expression grim. The rival syndicate working with Vance had mobilized. They didn't know where Nyla was being held, but they had just firebombed her apartment. They were hunting her, and they were willing to tear the city apart to flush her out. The old Woo-Jin would have viewed this as a tactical advantage. An emotional enemy makes mistakes, leaving their operations exposed. He would have countered with a measured strategic strike to cripple their supply lines. But as he looked at Nyla, asleep and defenseless on his velvet sofa, all cold strategy evaporated. A primal violent panic gripped his chest. A raw, suffocating emotion he hadn't felt since he was a bleeding teenager fighting for his life on the streets. He immediately ordered his men to double the estate's perimeter, pull his heaviest hitters from their lucrative port operations, and initiate a total lockdown. It was a massive, glaring overreaction. It left his most valuable territories completely unprotected. His lieutenant hesitated for a fraction of a second, recognizing the terrible, unprecedented vulnerability flashing in his boss's dark eyes. Woo-Jin was actively bleeding his own empire dry, just to build an impenetrable fortress around one woman. It was the exact definition of a fatal flaw. By trying to guarantee her safety with overwhelming force, he was signaling to every predator in the underworld exactly what he valued most. When the lieutenant quietly left to execute the orders, Woo-Jin walked over to the sofa. He slipped off his tailored suit jacket and carefully draped it over Nyla's shoulders, lingering just to feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He was the most feared man in the criminal underworld, yet as he gently brushed a stray curl from her cheek, he accepted the terrifying truth. She was his absolute weakness, and he was perfectly willing to let his entire kingdom burn to ash, just to ensure the flames never touched her. The penthouse had transformed from a gilded cage into a subterranean war room. For 3 days and 3 nights, the city outside buzzed with the frantic, violent energy of a manhunt, completely oblivious to the fact that the prey was sitting comfortably at the apex of the predator's food chain. Nyla and Woo-Jin moved around the massive mahogany table in a silent, synchronized dance of mutually assured destruction. The air was thick with the scent of black coffee and the sharp, lingering ozone of Woo-Jin's world. The high-tension energy between them had sharpened into something wildly efficient and undeniably intimate. Nyla was the architect, her brilliant legal mind weaving through the complex federal statutes and prosecutorial guidelines that District Attorney Vance planned to use against them. Woo-Jin was the executioner, his dark web of informants and shadow ledgers providing the exact phantom accounts and burner communications Nyla needed to turn Vance's trap inside out. They were working in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn shut against the skyline, leaving them illuminated only by the harsh, blue glow of encrypted laptops and the soft ambient light of a single desk lamp. The physical boundaries that had defined their initial hostility had completely eroded. Woo-Jin stood so close behind her chair that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, his tattooed arm caging her in as he leaned over to point at a decrypted cargo manifest. He used the south port to move the funds, Woo-Jin murmured, his deep, gravelly voice vibrating against her shoulder. The same port he ordered my men to vacate 3 weeks ago. Nyla didn't flinch away from his proximity. Instead, she leaned into the space, her pen flying across a legal pad as she instantly connected the dots. Which means he bypassed federal customs by using his own DA authority to declare the shipment a secure evidence transfer. If we blind drop the port authority logs into the defense discovery file, we trap him in federal perjury before he even finishes his opening statement. Woo-Jin looked down at her, a dangerous, breathtaking pride darkening his gaze. She wasn't just building a defense, she was forging a guillotine. The rigid, idealistic lawyer who had stepped into that courthouse elevator was gone. In her place sat a formidable, lethal strategist who understood that to kill a corrupt king, you couldn't play by the rules of the board. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a stray curl away from her face. A stark moment of tenderness in a room built for war. They were no longer lawyer and criminal. They were two halves of a perfectly constructed weapon, aimed directly at the heart of the city's corrupt justice system. And as Nyla looked up at him, her pulse hammering at the possessive heat in his eyes, she realized the defense they were building was absolutely airtight. The only thing she couldn't protect herself from was him. The encrypted audio file hissed through the penthouse speakers, cutting through the heavy, shadowed silence of the room. Woo-Jin stood motionless by the glass wall, his dark eyes locked on Nyla as she stared blankly at the glowing monitor. His network had just successfully bypassed the district attorney's secure private line. For Nyla, the voice echoing through the room wasn't just a corrupt official. It was the man who had shaped her entire adult life. District Attorney Vance. The mentor who had handed her her first major case, who had praised her unyielding brilliance, who had proudly told the press she was the uncorruptible future of the city's justice system. Is the loose end tied? Vance's voice was sterile, completely devoid of the warm paternal inflection he used in the courtroom. I need confirmation that the prosecutor is no longer a factor. Pin her disappearance on Han's syndicate. Wrap the media narrative, and let's move forward with the port acquisition. The breath left Nyla's lungs in a violent, jagged exhale. Seeing the illicit financial ledgers on paper was one thing. Hearing the casual, bureaucratic way her mentor confirmed her execution was a visceral, physical blow. There was no hesitation in Vance's tone. No regret. She wasn't a prized protégé or a champion of the law. She was just a calculated write-off on a bloody balance sheet. A cold, devastating numbness spread through her veins. The gavel, the badge, the long nights sacrificing her own safety to put criminals behind bars. It had all been a meticulously crafted lie. She had been the unwitting sword for a monster wearing a pristine suit, while the man the city called a demon stood quietly behind her, offering the only real protection she had ever known. Her hands began to tremble as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table, the crushing weight of the betrayal threatening to shatter her completely. She closed her eyes, fighting a desperate, losing battle against the grief burning in her throat. Then the heavy scent of expensive cologne and ozone wrapped around her. Woo-Jin didn't offer a hollow apology. He didn't offer pity, because pity had no place in the world they were about to enter. He simply stepped into her space, a towering, immovable force in a reality that had just lost its gravity. His large, tattooed hands covered hers, gripping them with a firm, grounding pressure that stopped her trembling instantly. "You can mourn the man you thought he was," Woo-Jin murmured, his voice a low, lethal vibration against the quiet devastation of the room. "Or you can open your eyes, look at the man he actually is, and help me bury him." Nyla opened her eyes. The tears hadn't fallen. The devastating grief had rapidly crystallized, hardening into something cold, sharp, and infinitely more dangerous. She turned her hand over, slowly lacing her fingers through the Mafia boss's dark, tattooed grip. "Play the audio again," she whispered, her voice stripped of its former idealism. "I want to memorize the sound of his confidence before we take everything he has." The city stretched out below the penthouse, a sprawling grid of oblivious light. Inside, the frantic, high-stakes energy of the past week had dissolved into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Tomorrow morning, Nyla would walk through the heavy mahogany doors of the municipal courthouse not as a prosecutor, but as the bait in a trap she had meticulously rewired. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The manila folders, now loaded with decrypted financial ledgers, Port Authority logs, and the damning audio file, sat squarely in the center of the dining table. It was a loaded gun, and tomorrow she was going to pull the trigger on her own career to destroy the men who built it. Woo-Jin watched her from the shadows of the room. For over a decade, his life had been a calculated ledger of violence, a continuous descent into a darkness he had long accepted as his permanent reality. But looking at Nyla, silhouetted against the glittering skyline, something profound had shifted within his chest. The sprawling empire he had built on fear and extortion was now being weaponized to forge a shield for one uncorrupted woman. It wasn't full absolution. His hands were far too stained for that. But as he prepared to risk his own freedom to ensure her survival, he felt the strange, unfamiliar weight of redemption. For the first time in his life, his absolute power was being used for something undeniably right. He crossed the room, his footsteps completely silent on the marble floor, and stopped just behind her. The space between them had become a sanctuary, the only honest ground left in a world built entirely on lies. "If we miss a single detail tomorrow," Nyla whispered, her breath ghosting against the cold glass, "Vance will have me arrested for treason before the lunch recess, and his cartel partners will execute you in a federal holding cell." Woo-Jin lifted his hand, his knuckles lightly brushing the tense line of her shoulder. The touch was feather-light, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the lethal ink marking his skin. "They won't get the chance. Tomorrow you are not stepping into their courtroom. They are stepping into our execution chamber." She leaned back just a fraction of an inch, allowing the solid, immovable warmth of his chest to anchor her. The rigid lines of her posture softened, the formidable lawyer yielding momentarily to the overwhelming gravity of the night. She turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his intense, calculating gaze. The air grew impossibly thin, thick with an undeniable, obsessive heat that had been quietly building since the elevator doors closed days ago. Woo-Jin's thumb traced the curve of her jaw, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes with a possessive, grounding certainty. "Sleep, counselor," he murmured, his voice a dark velvet promise. "Tomorrow we take their empire. Tonight, you are entirely safe." The heavy oak doors of the municipal courtroom swung open, and the suffocating glare of the fluorescent lights washed over Nyla. She stepped into the aisle clutching a familiar stack of manila files tightly against her chest. To the gallery, the press, and the presiding judge, she looked exactly as she was supposed to. A brilliant but deeply terrified prosecutor, buckling under the immense pressure of dismantling the city's most dangerous criminal syndicate. She deliberately let her shoulders round, dropping her chin a fraction of an inch to cast her eyes downward. It was a masterful performance. She was playing the perfect disposable lamb, wrapping herself in the naive idealism she had buried in a mafia boss's penthouse just days ago. Sitting at the prosecution table, District Attorney Vance adjusted his silk tie and gave her a warm paternal nod. It was the same reassuring smile he had used for 2 years to groom her, to weaponize her intellect for his own illicit gain. A cold, violent wave of nausea hit the back of Nyla's throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing a shaky, deferential smile in return. Vance bought it completely. He believed his trap was flawlessly set, assuming she was about to present the fabricated evidence that would lock Han Woo-Jin away forever and clear the path for Vance's own shadow empire. Then the side doors opened. The heavy clink of iron chains immediately silenced the murmuring gallery. Han Woo-Jin was led into the courtroom by 4 heavily armed bailiffs. Even in the sterile, oppressive light of the justice system, his dark, tailored suit and the lethal tattoos visible at his collar radiated an absolute, terrifying command. He was in handcuffs, willingly submitting to the physical restraints of a corrupt law to give her the stage she needed. For a man whose entire life had been defined by violent, unyielding control and ruthless self-preservation, surrendering to those chains was an astonishing act of trust. A quiet, bloody step toward a redemption no one else in this room would ever understand. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Vance. As he was forced into the defendant's chair, his dark, calculating gaze bypassed the entire room and locked directly onto Nyla. For a fraction of a second, the terrified facade melted from her eyes, replaced by the cold, brilliant fire they had forged together in the dark. A subtle, breathtaking smirk touched the corner of Woo-Jin's mouth before he instantly masked his expression in bored indifference. The silent, lethal pact was sealed. The judge struck his gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the cavernous room like a gunshot. Vance leaned over, whispering a final, poisonous word of encouragement into her ear. Nyla stood up, ensuring her hands trembled just enough as she opened her binder. The room held its breath, completely oblivious to the fact that the anxious woman approaching the podium wasn't there to present a defense. She was there to trigger an execution. Nyla approached the podium, the polished wood feeling cold beneath her fingertips. The courtroom was dead silent, every eye fixed on the trembling prosecutor, who was supposedly about to deliver the final blow to the city's most feared crime syndicate. She cleared her throat, adjusting the microphone with hands she deliberately allowed to shake. "Your Honor," Nyla began, her voice soft, projecting the exact fragility District Attorney Vance demanded of her. "The state calls its primary evidence into the record. We have compiled the financial ledgers, offshore routing numbers, and port authority logs that detail the illegal acquisition of the South Port." At the prosecution table, Vance leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound, paternal satisfaction washing over his face. He nodded at her, completely blind to the guillotine poised above his neck. Nyla picked up the thick stack of manila folders. She didn't hand them to the bailiff to pass to the defense. Instead, she distributed them directly to the judge, and then placed one squarely on the table in front of Vance. "These ledgers," Nyla continued, the manufactured tremor in her voice suddenly vanishing, replaced by a cold, resonant authority that echoed off the mahogany walls, "detail a massive, coordinated effort to bypass federal customs. However, Your Honor, they do not belong to the defendant." The judge opened the folder. His brow furrowed in deep, immediate confusion. Vance flipped his open. The smug satisfaction drained from his face in a sickening, instantaneous rush, leaving behind the pale, terrifying realization of a man stepping on a landmine. Printed on the first page, highlighted in stark, undeniable yellow, was the routing number to his own private blind trust. "The documents before you," Nyla stated, her posture straightening, her shoulders locking into a rigid, formidable line, show direct wire transfers from a rival cartel into a shell corporation wholly owned and operated by District Attorney Vance. Chaos erupted in the gallery. The press scrambled, recording devices clicking wildly. Objection! Vance roared, violently pushing his chair back as he scrambled to his feet. His polished, political mask shattered entirely, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. Your Honor, this is an absolute outrage. The prosecutor has been compromised by the defendant. She was abducted. She is speaking under duress. I am speaking under oath. Nyla fired back, her voice cutting through the rising panic with lethal surgical precision. She didn't flinch. She stared her former mentor down, her dark eyes blazing with a devastating, unyielding fire. And I am submitting into evidence port security footage and an encrypted audio recording of District Attorney Vance ordering my assassination to cover up his own federal racketeering charges. At the defense table, the heavy iron chains around Han Woo-Jin's wrists clinked softly as he leaned forward. Amidst the screaming gallery and the frantic, echoing pounding of the judge's gavel, the feared Mafia boss simply watched the woman at the podium. A dark, breathtaking pride flared in his intense gaze. She wasn't just surviving his ruthless world. She had just crowned herself its queen. The gavel cracked like rapid gunfire against the mahogany block, but the judge had completely lost control of the room. District Attorney Vance was purple with rage, his political mask entirely shattered. He pointed a trembling finger at Nyla, screaming over the frantic pandemonium of the press gallery. Arrest her. Bailiffs, take this compromised prosecutor into custody immediately. She is conspiring with a known terrorist. Nyla stood her ground at the podium, her heart hammering violently against her ribs, but she didn't step back. The two heavily armed bailiffs stationed at the front of the courtroom moved, but they didn't walk toward Nyla. They stepped seamlessly to the main double doors, sliding the heavy steel deadbolts into place with a resounding, undeniable thud. Two more guards positioned themselves at the side exits, their hands resting entirely too naturally on their holstered weapons. Then a sharp metallic click cut through the screaming room. At the defense table, the heavy iron chains binding Han Woo-Jin dropped effortlessly to the polished floor. The key had been resting in his palm the entire time. He stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders and adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored dark suit. The sterile, oppressive hierarchy of the justice system evaporated the moment he stepped out from behind the table. He wasn't a defendant anymore. He was the apex predator, and he had just locked the doors to the cage. Vance's shouting choked off into a strangled gasp. The color drained entirely from his face as he realized the bailiffs weren't municipal employees. They were Woo-Jin's heaviest hitters, wearing stolen federal uniforms. Woo-Jin walked toward the center of the room with the quiet, lethal confidence of a man accustomed to absolute control. He completely ignored the judge, whose gavel hung frozen in midair. He bypassed the defense stand and walked directly to the prosecution podium, stepping right into Nyla's space. His towering frame positioned itself perfectly to shield her from the hostile room. Objection, Woo-Jin said. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The deep, gravelly vibration of his voice commanded an instant, suffocating silence across the cavernous courtroom. He looked down at Vance, his sharp gaze intense and calculating, radiating a dark, protective obsession that no longer needed to hide in the shadows of a penthouse. This was the brutal evolution of a man rewriting his own dark legacy, burning down his underworld anonymity to stand publicly beside the woman who had risked everything for the truth. You ordered a hit on my lawyer, Woo-Jin murmured, leaning forward and resting his tattooed hands on the podium right beside Nyla's. You used my city, my docks, and my name to do it. But your fatal mistake, Vance, was assuming I would let you breathe the same air as her after you put a target on her back. The district attorney stumbled backward, tripping over his own chair. The illusion of the legal system had officially ended. The Mafia had just taken the floor. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just heavy. It was apocalyptic. The presiding judge, a man who had handed down life sentences with a flick of his wrist, sat completely frozen behind his elevated bench, the wooden gavel slipping from his sweaty grip. The legal hierarchy had been entirely dismantled in less than 60 seconds. District Attorney Vance scrambled backward, his pristine suit bunching around his shoulders as he frantically looked toward the locked doors. He was a man who had spent his entire life wielding the law as a weapon, only to realize he had brought a piece of paper to a gunfight. You can't do this, Vance stammered, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at the podium. This is a court of law. You are a criminal, Han. Woo-Jin didn't even blink. He reached inside his tailored jacket, pulling out a sleek black flash drive, and tossed it onto the prosecution table. It clattered loudly against the polished mahogany, sounding like the final nail in a coffin. That is every offshore ledger, every wire transfer, and the name of every bribed official in your pocket, Woo-Jin stated, his deep voice carrying an absolute, terrifying finality. He didn't look at the judge. He turned his dark, piercing gaze directly toward the press gallery, who were furiously recording every second of the confrontation. And as of 2 minutes ago, my network broadcasted those exact files to every federal oversight committee and major news outlet in the country. Your cartel partners are currently being hunted, your assets are frozen, and your political throne is ash. Nyla stood beside him, her pulse hammering an erratic, adrenaline-fueled rhythm. She watched Vance, the man who had mentored her, the man who had callously ordered her death, collapse into his chair. He was reduced to a pathetic, ruined shell of a man, stripped of his titles and his false righteousness. The realization hit Nyla with a profound, breathtaking clarity. If she had played by the rules, if she had trusted the blindfold of justice, she would be dead in an alley right now, and Vance would be cutting the ribbon on a newly acquired port. The law had failed her completely. It was fragile, easily bought, and entirely corruptible. True balance hadn't been restored by a judge's ruling or a meticulously argued legal brief. It had been restored by the ruthless, absolute power of the Mafia boss standing shoulder to shoulder with her. He had burned his own anonymity to the ground to enact a dark, undeniable justice that the legal system was too weak to deliver. Woo-Jin turned his head, his intense, calculating eyes softening only as they met hers. The possessive, dangerous heat radiating from his towering frame was no longer a threat. It was the ultimate shield. As the distant, approaching wail of real federal sirens finally broke the silence of the city outside, Nyla didn't pull away from the criminal. She leaned into him, finally understanding that to truly win, you had to be willing to rewrite the rules. The wail of the federal sirens grew deafening, echoing through the high-vaulted ceilings of the municipal courthouse. In the center of the frantic chaos, the presiding judge finally brought his gavel down against the block. It was a weak, trembling strike, completely devoid of the authority it once held. The hollow sound didn't signal the delivery of the law. It signaled the absolute surrender of a broken system. Federal agents swarmed through the heavy double doors, their badges flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights, but they bypassed the defense table entirely. They moved straight for District Attorney Vance, dragging him from his leather chair as he stammered pathetic, broken threats. The man who had built a pristine career on the blood and sacrifice of others was being handcuffed by the very regulations he had manipulated. Nyla watched her former mentor being hauled away, feeling the last lingering thread of her rigid idealism snap. She looked down at the prosecution podium. Her meticulously organized legal binder, the symbol of her entire life's work, sat open next to the microphone. Slowly, deliberately, she closed it. She didn't need the fragile shield of a courtroom anymore. She turned to Woo-Jin. The heavy iron chains that had bound him lay discarded on the polished marble floor, a physical representation of the absolute control he had just reclaimed. He stood tall and commanding, the lethal ink on his neck and hands a stark, unapologetic contrast to his perfectly tailored dark suit. He wasn't looking at the fleeing judge or the arrested politicians. His intense, calculating gaze was fixed solely on her. He held out his hand. It wasn't a demand. It was a profound, dangerous invitation into a world where loyalty was absolute and protection was ruthless. Nyla didn't hesitate. She stepped away from the podium, leaving her old life behind, and placed her hand firmly in his. His large, tattooed fingers wrapped around hers, grounding her with a possessive, breathtaking heat. The psychological shift was instantaneous and irreversible. The terrified, law-abiding prosecutor was dead. In her place stood a formidable queen, completely unafraid of the darkness because she now held the leash to its most dangerous monster. The heavy mahogany doors swung open to the courthouse steps. The flashbulbs of 100 press cameras erupted like lightning in the night, capturing the unprecedented sight. They didn't step out as a captive and her kidnapper, nor as a lawyer and her criminal defendant. They walked out in perfect synchronized step, the towering, untouchable Korean mafia boss and the brilliant, resilient black lawyer. Woo-Jin shifted slightly, his hand sliding smoothly to the small of her back in a public, undeniable claim of protection. The city that had tried to break them both now lay completely at their feet. They descended the stone steps into the cool air, leaving the ruined justice system behind them, irrevocably bound together at the apex of a beautiful, lethal new empire.